since it allows us to bring together experts and institutions from the Caribbean, leading to closer cooperation and concrete results around international cooperation for sustainable development. In the Association for Caribbean States, we are convinced that political or any other differences that exist among states provide opportunities to come together. And so we take advantage of this opportunity to address something that threatens the region, to exchange knowledge on the use of Sargassum is one of the activities that we will be organizing this week. This capacity building unit is part of climate change adaptation strategies that humanity has to consider, and we have to go even further. Our planet and the Caribbean in particular is experience heightened phenomena that affect our sustainability. And we must therefore implement actions to reduce the vulnerability of our populations. Sargassum comes to our shores, disrupting a series of activities that affects the well-being of our population and our quality of life. We have a lot to do in order to improve our response capacity and to reduce the impact of Sargassum on our societies. The situation that humanity is facing right now requires our best efforts, consensus-based action, and coordination. We need close cooperation amongst associate and member states. It is evident that everything that is occurring within our Caribbean Sea will affect tourism, trade, and transport, and will affect natural disasters. We must work together to reduce adverse effects of these phenomena so that future generations can continue to enjoy our beautiful seas and shores. At various points in time, I have mentioned that crises present opportunities that must be analyzed in depth. As we face the challenge of the pandemic, we must redouble our efforts to protect our livelihoods and our environment within the Caribbean. I hope that the knowledge shared and imparted during this session this week will be helpful for all of the members of our Association of Caribbean States. I thank you.
Gracias, Su Excelencia.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We will now hear from Ms. Luisa Hortensia Solchaga, Director of the Technical and Scientific Cooperation with Central America and the Caribbean from the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Ana Leticia. Good morning, Secretary General. I hope you are well. Before I address all of the colleagues who are with us today, I just wanted to ensure that all of the experts from Mexico have made it into the room. If you're already in the room, please let us know, just to make sure that no one's been left out. Good morning, this is David Laura. Pleasure to see you. We're all here. Thank you. Good morning, this is Roberto Marco from Ensenada, and I'm here and ready to go. Thank you. Are we missing anyone else? Dr. Casas, your microphone is off. Yes, Dr. Elisa Serviere is still to come in, as well as Dr. Alejandra Piñón and Mr. Pedro González Ramírez. I think they were still waiting to be admitted into the room.
Veo que la doctora Alejandra.
Oh, I see Dr. Alejandra and Dr. Elisa Serviere were able to enter.
Gracias, buenos días.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Good morning to all. Good morning. Can we move on? Or shall we wait for everyone? No, we can continue. Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, Secretary General. It is always a pleasure to be part of this space, a regional space for cooperation within the ACS. I'm very pleased to be able to share these capacity building sessions today that Mexico is offering. As Secretary General Sebonghe mentioned, we must work together to preserve the diversity and natural beauty of this space that we share, which is the Caribbean Sea. It is in our interest to fight the effects of climate change and to address each and every factor that can harm this natural environment that we as member states share. For me, as I said, it is a pleasure to be here and to cede the floor to our colleagues from the National Polytechnic Institute. They're experts, they have a lot of knowledge to share with you. AMICSID is, of course, at the disposal of all of you who are participating in these sessions in Spanish and English and French. We, as you may know, are the Mexican International Cooperation for Development Agency, and we're at your disposal to share these best practices and knowledge that our Mexican experts have. Although it would seem that a lot of the topics that we've addressed thus far have a very particular order, I just wanted to let you know that although the sequence is not strict, there is a lot of coordination in terms of how the topics are being presented and how they flow into each other. Our experts from the Polytechnic Institute have paid a lot of attention to the development of the various courses, and I hope it will be useful to you. Thank you once again for participating, and thanks to the ACS for facilitating this space for us to hold these sessions. Thank you. We would now like to ask all of the participants to turn on their cameras so that we can take a group photo. Please allow us a few minutes with your cameras on so that we can take a group picture to properly document this event.
Todavía continuamos con el proceso de fotografías.
We're still taking pictures. Please don't turn off your cameras, and if you haven't already done so, please turn on your camera so that you can appear in the group photo.
Un par de minutos más, por favor.
If you'll allow us just a few more minutes.
Con esto concluimos la inauguración del curso.
The opening session is now officially concluded. And before we begin today's session, I'm going to read presenter bios. Dr. Margarita Casas Valdez is a researcher and professor at CICIMAR and is part of the Technology Development Department in the area of microalgae. Her professional work started with a biology degree with a specialization in fisheries within the Interdisciplinary Center of Oceanographic Sciences of the Polytechnic Institute. She has a master's in fishery science and a doctorate on aquaculture. She is a laureate of the Peña Colorada Award as a result of her PhD. She has had various positions, including Director of Research at CICIMAR, Director of the Regional Fishery Research Institute, part of the Fishery and Aquaculture Center, and Interdisciplinary Oceanographic Sciences Director within the Polytechnic Institute. As part of her research and teaching work, she has supervised 27 undergraduate and postgraduate theses. She has published 165 journal articles and books. She has led 47 scientific research projects, has presented over 200 times at conferences, and has been part of numerous advisory bodies. Her research work in southern Baja California started many years ago. She has studied macroalgae and sargassum and undertaken abundant surveys of these species. She has continued research in macroalgae in the coastal areas of southern Baja California. She focuses on ecology, evaluation, and the use of macroalgae as animal stock. We also have Mr. Roberto Marcos Ramirez, an oceanographer and a graduate of the Autonomous University of Baja California. He received his degree in oceanography in 1987. He has over 30 years of experience in the industry, in the marine algae industry. He started a firm that focuses on gracilis exploitation in the Gulf of Mexico for the manufacture of agar. He was then development manager at Production Pacific Industries Limited and focused on mechanized production of macrocystis from 1998 to 2004. In 2007, he founded Marine Algae Limited, a company that focuses on the use of new technologies for new products for animal feed, fish feed, cosmetics, bioplastics, and algae extracts for agricultural purposes. They are the leading Mexican industry in this field, exporting to many countries, including China, Korea, Japan, Australia, Africa, Chile, and the US, amongst others. He has a lot of experience in the harvest and management of Sargassum. The firm also has the first macrocystis commercial development operation and also works a lot with Sargassum. We also have with us Mr. David Lora Sanchez. He's an oceanographer and a graduate of the Faculty of Marine Sciences of the Baja California University. He started out as a technical resource in shrimp aquaculture in the Upper Californian Gulf, monitoring water quality and pond zones. He also worked at Agar-Mex, an agar-agar firm from Spain. For many years, he participated in stock management of algae, including as director of Agar-Mex. He then started Algas Pacific, a company that extracts organic substances from algae for use in agriculture. These are primarily used in Mexico, but are also exported to the US, Mexico, and Spain. The US, Chile, and Spain. Dr. Elisa Servier Zaragoza is a researcher in the Biology Institute of Baja California Sur, and she works in the macroalgae laboratory of the National Research System, and she's a level 2 researcher there. She's a regular member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences. Her background includes a bachelor's in biology, a master of sciences focusing on biology, and a PhD also in biology from the Faculty of Sciences of UNAM. Her main expertise is on the phytophthora of Jalisco and Nayarit. She received the silver medal Gabino Manella because of her performance during her Masters of Science, and another award within the Master of Sciences at UNAM. She focuses on ecology and taxonomy of microalgae and the ecology of marine ecosystems. She has published 74 articles, 2 books, and 17 book chapters, and has also widely contributed to dissemination of scientific knowledge on this topic. Dr. Alejandra Piñón Jimata is also with us today. She's the director of the Interdisciplinary Oceanographic and Marine Sciences Institute, also part of the National Research System, Level 1, and also a graduate of the Faculty of Sciences of UNAM. She has a Master's of Science on Marine Sciences. She did her master's on fisheries and their ecology. She has a PhD from the Marine Sciences Institute of UNAM, where she studied macroalgal blooms and their relationship with nutrient flows due to anthropogenic activities. She coordinates a seminar on technological development for master's and PhD students. She has worked on the macrophysiology of macroalgae and she has supervised numerous theses on this subject. Professor Pedro Gilberto González Ramirez is also here with us today. He started out at CICIMAR with a bachelor's in biology and marine sciences and did his master's at the same entity. His expertise include survey techniques and sampling techniques, biology and fishery, focusing on shrimp, tuna, mollusks, among others. He is a professor at the master's level and has developed a variety of projects on productivity using marine resources. He has also taken part in thesis evaluations. His research focuses on shrimp, sardines, tuna, swordfish, industrial infrastructure, port infrastructure, and the processing of tuna, the biology and population of clam populations, fisheries and aquaculture, productivity of ecosystems in southern Baja California, and the use of sargassum as feed for egg-laying hens. We also have Dr. Luis Mejia Macario with us today. He is a chemical engineering PhD out of the University of Birmingham in England, and he's a full-time researcher at the Technological Institute of Misanta. He is a professor and part of the National Research Network. His research focuses on technical development and innovation with prototypes, liquid solid extractors heated with vapor, heat exchange, a drying oven for the dehydration of vegetable material and food items, also equipment for distillation and solids extraction. He was chair of the Biochemical Engineering Academy and has supervised over 40 student projects. He has many years of experience in Tamamotos, Imaulitas, and worldwide corporations. As you can see, the qualifications of our facilitators for this week is extensive and guarantees the high quality of the instruction that will be imparted during this week. I will now give the floor over to Maria Margarita Casas Valdez so that we can get started with the course in full. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And Leticia, my thanks to His Excellency Secretary General Sabonge for providing the space, and my greetings and thanks also to Ms. Solchaga Lopez for introducing this initiative. It is a pleasure for us to be here as facilitators and to have you here with us during the opening of the course. I'm now going to share my screen so that we can get started.
While you're sharing your screen, let us look at the course. Please, all of your questions, please write them in the chat. We will then gather all of them because of the time given and the dynamics of the course. All questions will be read out at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Thank you. So, since Dr. Ramirez has spoken, in this course, we are going to look at the work done, the work before us in these 5 days. I will be here, and I really want to thank you for being here with us, along with our General Director and Dr. Sanchez, Dr. Elisa Serviere Zaragoza from the Biology Research Center, Dr. Alejandra Piñón Jimate, and Maestro Pedro Gonzalez, and Dr. Luis Mejia Macario from the Institute, from the IPN Institute, along with ACS and Amexid. So, before starting, I wish to make a comment. We are going to look at 2 issues. First, the global history of the seaweed industry, its uses and applications. We will have a short break, and subsequently, we will go on to topic 2, which are the types of microalgae harvest. And at the end, as was mentioned, we will leave some time for questions, and that will be at the end of the presentation. So, everyone can hear me just fine? Yes, we can hear you clearly. So, the origin of microalgae collection and harvesting is as old as civilizations. From the outset, algae we see was collected along coastal communities, and the main reason was for food and also for medicinal reasons. We have some records that show this, as we see the case of the coasts of Ireland, probably from the Neolithic period, where seaweed was collected to enrich depleted post-glacial soils, and also it was used for human food and feed for animals. There is more evidence that was found. Forgive me the interruption. We are not seeing your screen. Forgive me. And thank you. Can you see it now? No. Now, can you see it? No, we still don't see your screen. Forgive me. Well, I was saying that this is topic 1. We have 2 introductory topics. This one is the history of the seaweed industry in the world, its uses and applications. And then topic 2 will be the types of microalgae harvest. So we are now starting with our first topic. Forgive me, doctor. We would like to see your screen. If you could assist us, please.
Voy a hacer,
Let me try to do that.
voy a compartir
I will now share my screen.
yo abro la
I have opened up the topic, the presentation, but you can't see it? No, doctor, we cannot. You will see a button below that says share. Yes, I am using the share button. Now can you see it? No, doctor. And now? Still nothing? No. Oh no. I'm a bit nervous. No, it's all right. Don't worry. I've opened it. It's on my screen and I am seeing it on screen. When you click on the share button, different screens open up and you have to choose the screen that you wish to project. So I will share. Can you see it now? We are seeing your menu window. Can you see it now? You chose the window for course presentation. So when you click on share, you should choose the PowerPoint presentation. I chose the topic. Yes. Now can you see it? Yes. Now we can see your presentation. Forgive me, everyone. And thank you, doctor. So now we can start with the global history of the seaweed industry, its uses and applications. As I had said earlier, the use of seaweed is as old as the origin of the first coastal communities in the world, especially along the coasts of Ireland. And there is documentation and records that are quite old, as we see in the case of the coasts of Ireland, where most likely since the Neolithic period, we see that they were harvesting seaweed to enrich their depleted post-glacial soils and as human food and feed for animals. Later on, there is more evidence which we see in Chile, in Monte Verde 2, which is a human settlement where approximately 14,000 years ago, roughly, in that settlement, they were using seaweed for nutritional and medicinal purposes. And that was in the late Pleistocene period. And with the excavation done, what they found within the mouth of these people, they found some balls of seaweed of the Sargassum variety. In Korea, about 10,000 years ago, when they did archaeological digs, they also found remains of seaweed. And then in China, in the year 2700, in the Pensao book, there is a mention of Sargassum using it as part of medicinal herbs to cure goiter. Then in 79 AD, Pliny the Elder mentioned that Maerl seaweed was collected by the peoples of Great Britain and Gaul to fertilize their soils. As I mentioned, the use of seaweed as food, this has been around for a long time. And we have specific documentation from the 4th century in Japan and the 6th century in China, where seaweed has been used for food. And something interesting here, we believe that from the 4th century, that is when they started consuming sushi. From the 4th century, it's a very popular dish. What they did, they would roll the rice in the nori sheets. Then, proof of the existence of seaweed in different civilizations, we can see from the 4th to the 8th century in Japan, in the imperial court, they accepted payment of taxes and duties with nori or algae such as wakame and kombu. And in the 8th century as well, the Vikings were already collecting seaweed that was thrown onto the beach, and they used it as feed or fodder for cattle and also as agricultural fertilizers. In the 12th century, in France, they started producing kelp meal as agricultural fertilizers, and this was in France. Also in the 12th century, Ireland was harvesting seaweed to use them for human food and also to improve their soils. The Ireland always had these depleted soils. And now in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, they started to extract soda from the algae, from the seaweed, and they use this for the manufacture of glass and soap, and they would extract soda to make glass, soap, and gunpowder. In 1775, in Greece, they used seaweed, Alcidium and Corallina, which you can see on the slide, as to destroy worms, as anthelmintics. So the uses of seaweeds were expanded over time. In 1658, they discovered Kanten or agar, and this was in Japan. From 1662, rural production began in small rustic factories. So they would boil the seaweed and then get a gelatin, and that gelatin would be used, and it was always very hot. So in these small factories, they started to increase production throughout Japan, so that Japan then became the first global monopoly in producing agar until the year 1940. Robert Cook began to use that agar as a growing medium for bacteria, and it has been irreplaceable for that purpose because agar has certain properties because of its composition that make it excellent to use for that reason. So from 1940, there was increasing development of agar industries in the United States, in Spain, South Africa, Australia, and Russia. Then, subsequently, between 1700 and 1820, Ireland used kelp ash to make soap, paper, and glass. In 1811, Bernard Couturier started the production of iodine, discovered from kelp in France, such as macrocystis and other types of seaweed. And he started to use this for photography, and iodine became essential for this. and the seaweed was used for this. Industrial production in iodine began in 1830 with France, Scotland, Ireland, Norway being the main countries that used it for the production of iodine. And the factories that used the seaweed closed in 1959. Subsequently, between 1820 and 1940, in Ireland, in addition to using seaweed to extract iodine for photography, they also started to use it for medicinal purposes. So in 1658, they started to use the carrageenans in the food industry. And in 1885, they started with the pharmaceutical industry. And in 1937, industrial production of carrageenans began. In 1881, Stanford discovered alginates. They extracted them from the seaweed. And France in 1900 started to produce Norgine, produced on a small scale. And then from 1929, large-scale production began by the Kelco company located in San Diego, California. Then in 1914, in the United States, macrocystis was used for producing gunpowder. In Ireland, in 1940, they started the alginate phase. Why? Because all of the seaweed that they harvest, they use them to produce alginate as thickening agents for food and also for cosmetics. In 1947, the government set up the company Alginates Industries Limited, and in 1955, its name changed to Aramara. The production of agar is quite interesting. I enjoy talking about it because how can this production take place when we're thinking of when we know it was discovered in 1658 quite by chance, and innkeeper was in the woods in Japan and was caught in a very heavy storm. And so this innkeeper now used the seaweed in a dessert, gave that to the person, and then all that remained, they used it, it crystallized, and then the next day, they started to boil it, and you can see they got that gelatin that they can use. And that is the origin of the production of agar. And then, of course, we mentioned this already. Japan started their monopoly. So that's the agar. And here you see the powder. It's a very crystalline powder. And I like this picture on the left because that is how agar was produced at the outset. They would gather the seaweed and they would have these wooden trays. So that hot agar now, they would boil it and then they would place it in these wooden trays and they would leave it there for a while, and then it will get colder, it will crystallize, and then they would collect the crystallized agar. And once again, from 1970, there was great expansion of the agarophyte industries in the United States, Spain, South Africa, Australia, and Russia. And in Spain, they started a factory, a very important one, with a very long history called Hispanagar. So nowadays, we have modern factories with very heavily mechanized for agar, for the carrageenans. Here we have pictures of the industries in San Diego. And what do they use these products for? Agar, we have some diagrams here. We see that it's used in the food industry. Its main use is for using gelatin, and it's also used for different flans and pudding, for different sausages, and it's also used in the production of sausages. It's quite popular in that dessert. And there's another interesting point with this dessert, mitsumame. It's over 100 years. They've been consuming this for over 100 years. It's a mixture of fruit, and the little cubes you see on the plate are cubes of agar. And it's quite interesting how they make this sweet, this dessert. And then the corners keep you can see they're very solid cubes, very well defined. And you could only do this with agar because of the features of its composition. I had already mentioned that it can be used as bacteriological culture media, even though it's used in other products as well, but the agar is of a very high quality. And the carrageenans as well have a wide range of uses, as you can see, for gelatins, as emulsifiers, in different types of milk and marmalades. Several products, all of the products that you can see to make juices. You have it in powder form, it can be dissolved. It's used for ice cream and for different beverages. And anything with milk, carrageenans are used because with milk, it combines with the other sulfites in the carrageenans, and then it's a property that helps make these products. There are also many uses, as to clarify beer. If we see that they have so many uses, I think that the alginates have the widest range of uses, because anything you think of, they are using alginates. They are used as thickeners and as mordants, and you can use them in several industries. Here we have a few examples. In the textile industry, it's used a great deal, and it acts as a mordant. Also, it's used to make different products and to stabilize emulsions, for syrups as well as an emulsifier. and also for dental impressions. Alginates worldwide are highly consumed in all areas linked to the dental industry, and especially for dental impressions. So you get an excellent quality, and it's a lower cost than if we compare it with agar. Agar has an excellent production as well, but it's a higher cost when we compare it with the use of alginates. And more recently, alginates have been used to make for microencapsulation spheres. So we can summarize in this way: global trade of this industry is geared towards 5 sectors. Foods for human consumption, 70% of seaweed. For the phycocolloids industry, agar, alginates, and carrageenans, 25%. As additives for animal fodder, and this is for animal fodder, and also the cosmetic and pharmaceutical industry to make agroecological products, such as organic products, and also as organic fertilizers and biostimulants. Once we have this information, then we want to see what is the current status of seaweed production. From 2018, we see that they produced 33.3 million tons of seaweed. That is wet weight. And so this is an important production in the global market. Worldwide, it's very important worldwide. And we need to highlight here that 97% of this production is cultivated, and only 3%, which you see in the blue bar, is harvested in the natural environment, so that the production of the seaweed, we can see that the growth has been significant over the years. And also, we want to know which countries are the main seaweed producers worldwide. China, Indonesia, Philippines, Republic of Korea, and Japan. They are the countries that produce the most seaweed. And as we had mentioned earlier, about 97% come from cultivation. Then I think it's also important to highlight and to share with you what the largest quantities are. We have data from up to 2016, and the seaweed that is cultivated in the largest volumes is the one you can see, which is Euchema, a red alga, and with some green tones as well. So Euchema contributed 35% of global production. And then we have the Laminara japonica, which contributes 27% of global production with over 8,000 tons. Then we have Gracillarias for over 4,000 tons. And then 2,000 tons, Capsicus, which is about 1,500 tons. Then we have Nori with 1,300 tons. So this shows us the production of the most important species that are cultivated and make these great contributions to the world production of seaweed. And which are the countries that produce these cultivated species? The ones we have mentioned. And we see that it is linked to the pie chart we saw earlier. That is who these main producing countries are: China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Republic of Korea, and Japan. And what does the future hold? What do the market analysts say, or what will be the future of harvesting and uses of algae? So, when we look at the markets, we see that what they mention is that in 2017, that the global algae market is valued at between $4 and $6 billion. So we're speaking of algae that's used as raw material. And they also mention that by 2024, the value will be even more, up to $9 billion, with a growth rate of 12% between 2018 and 2024. The FAO in 2016, the value given is $10.6 billion. And that's for algae and its products. Not just the algae as raw material, but also adding the carrageenans and other products. And their estimate is that by 2025, the value of the seaweed and its products will be $26 billion. So this is something that's encouraging to those who are interested in getting into the industry of algae, because you can see that the growth, the significant growth, will continue for the algae industry. When analysis is done by region, we see North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, Americas, Africa. Then we see that logically, the largest market share globally for seaweed is in the Asia Pacific region. And in that region, the estimate is that growth will be 11.4% between 2018 and 2024. When the global seaweed market is analyzed by product, we look at the three types: the red seaweed, and brown and green. So what we see is that the red seaweed are those with the highest market share. And as a result, these are the ones that will have the greatest growth between 2018 and 2024, which is the blue on our graph. They also estimate that the growth of the red seaweed market, it will be about 12.3% growth. As you can see, this is the growth for the algae, and it will be less for the green algae. So when analysis is done of this global seaweed market, looking at its use or application, then what we can see on our graph is that the largest application and consumption is for human food, for human consumption. If you remember in the previous slides, we had already mentioned that about 70% of the use of seaweed is geared towards human food. And then we have the hydrocolloids, then alginates, fertilizers, a lesser amount, also animal fodder additives, and others. And what they mention here is the growth exhibited in the use of these phycocolloids. It will exhibit growth of 13.5% between 2018 and 2024. And there will be growth as well for use as human food. And that continues to be the larger number. Also, we see the references made to the largest market share, as we mentioned, in the Asia Pacific region. That is China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Korea, and Japan. So, what can we say then about the future uses of algae, or what does the literature on this tell us about the future uses? Doctor, forgive the interruption. Would it be possible for us to have a quick 10-minute break? I only have 2 more slides. Okay, so yes, when you finish, then we will have our break and we will go on to topic 2. Thank you. Thank you. So what is the future, what predicted for algae? Well, as nutraceuticals, because remember that these nutraceuticals will be used in products. It makes a contribution to the nutrients in the organism and also help to improve health. And that is why it is considered that they can be used directly as nutraceuticals. Very quickly, these are some of the properties we can mention. They can be used as hypoglycemics and also biomedical applications because they have many biologically active compounds: fluoroethanes, carotenoids, fucoidan, peptides, sterols, terpenoids. And these can be used to prevent degenerative illnesses such as arthritis and hypertension. Also, more properties, we have antibiotic, antiviral, antifungal, antioxidant, antithrombotic properties as well. And other uses as well for these new uses. They can be used as biofertilizers and biostimulants. Why? Because when they extract, they can be used to stimulate plant growth. They produce faster rates of germination. They develop the root system. They increase the leaf area, the quality of fruits, and the strength of the plants. Another use will be biochar or biocarbon, which is an improver of soils. It improves soil fertility, and bioplastics because they are biodegradable and also for producing biogas. So these latter ones are the newer uses that seaweed can have, and they are of interest, really. Thank you. Let us now have our break. Thank you, Doctor. Yes, we now have a 10-minute break. And forgive me for interrupting. No, that's quite fine. Thank you. Let us return. It's 12:15. Let us return at 12:25, please. Thank you.
Great. Can you confirm that you can see my screen, please? Yes, indeed. Great, thank you. Let's move on to the second topic for today, which is part of our introduction. We're going to talk about the types of macroalgae harvesting that can be practiced, and we're going to have an overview of their respective ecological effects. From the very beginning of time, algae have been harvested in a variety of ways by different people, different countries with coastal areas. From the most rudimentary method, which is simply to collect algae deposited by the tides, and then over time, a variety of methods that were increasingly sophisticated were developed. And that's what we're going to look at in detail in a bit. But this wide variety of ways to harvest algae, really, what we really want to look at today is how harvesting is done, and we're going to categorize it in 4 groups. First of all, the first type would be when the whole plant is removed. And you're seeing there the illustration with a rake where from the root, the plant is ripped up, pulled out. Here there's another method, which is a tool that digs down into the ground. It's turned and then pulled out, and that removes the entire plant. With this type of macroalgae harvesting, repopulation takes place via spores, through propagules, or through the young remnants that are left over after harvesting. Usually, you're not going to see every single plant being pulled up within that harvest. Usually, the small remnants are left behind because they're not big enough to be picked up by the tools. But keep that in mind. Repopulation with this method relies on spores, propagules, or young remnants that are left behind. Under type 2, the reproductive and vegetative structures are removed. That is, the part of the plant that's above the roots are pulled out. But that also affects the reproductive structures, as you can imagine. So you see there manually pulling out or cutting the algae. And usually with this method, repopulation is carried out via the regeneration of bonded basal structures that are left behind, and as in type 2, by spores, propagules, or whatever young pieces of the plant or young specimens are left behind after harvesting. The third type of macroalgae harvesting only removes the vegetative canopy, the fronds, as it were. Usually there's even parts of the plant that's above the stratum, sometimes even rising to the surface. And so that's the part that's cut, just the canopy. And in this case, repopulation takes place via regeneration and reproduction of the partially harvested plants, because harvesting is partial, but also, as in type 1, through spores, propagules, and by definition, whatever parts of the plant remain are left behind. Under type 4, what is harvested is what is deposited along the shoreline by waves, by storms, by tides. These are constantly depositing algae onto the shoreline, onto beaches, and it's just a question of collecting what is left along the shoreline. And the effect of this type of harvesting on repopulation is minimal or non-existent, because this happens naturally. And just to recap, there's 4 types of harvesting methods. 1, where the full plant is removed, which is the case with the Gracilaria, where the whole plant is taken. Type 2, which entails only removing a portion of the vegetative and reproductive structures, usually 15 to 20 centimeters of what's attached to the rhizoid. Here you see an illustration of a diver manually cutting. Type 3, which is what is used with macrocystis. What's used is a boat that's specially designed with a cutting mechanism. And what the boat does is it cuts up to a certain height, usually 1.2 meters depth. So the plants retain the full structure. It would be like cutting off the branches of a tree in a forest, but the rest of the tree remains. Here you see the sporophylls, which as closer to the bottom of the plant isn't really touched. And the growth meristems are also at that lower part of the plant. So the fronds can continue to grow and develop after the harvest. And here you see examples of type 4 harvesting, which is simply people who are going along the shoreline, along the beach, collecting what has been deposited. Under type 4 harvesting, the methods are quite varied. In shallow waters, you can use this type of netting operated by perhaps 2 people, sometimes more, and the algae is simply collected in the net as they're passed across the surface. In bays and shallow estuaries with sandy beaches, dredging is often undertaken with nets that are about 5 meters in length. And these nets have a triangular structure, almost like a pyramid, that keep the mouth of the net continuously open. And so the boat moves along and the net trawls along. Another option, where there are rocky areas with concentrations of algae, for instance, you can see in the illustration there a little pocket where there's an agglomeration of algae, and a vacuuming device is being deployed in order to suction the algae using pumps. Another example, Druvillea antarctica in southern Chile is harvested whole. Here you see the way that the plant is removed whole or collected from what's been deposited on the beach. So here you see type 1 harvesting and type 4 harvesting. Another example, also from Chile, this one in the central part of Chile, is Chondrocanthes chamisoy harvesting. Harvesting is done by removing the plant in its entirety almost. Regeneration in this case depends on spores, fragments that are left behind that are large enough to be able to propagate, or whole young plants that are left behind. Laminaria harvesting. Laminaria is also extracted entirely, usually from the rhizoid. Here you see the boat has a rake that is trolled and pulls the plant up in its entirety. That is type 1 harvesting, and therefore repopulation takes place thanks to spores, thanks to pieces that are large enough to be able to propagate, and whole younger plants that are left behind. The harvesting of Ascophyllum nodosum this is a traditional. This algae has been harvested for a very long time, and because of the morphology of this species, commercial harvests tend to compromise the reproductive structures of the plant. And this species has a very marked reproductive seasonality during winter. So if harvesting takes place during the winter, usually what you see is massive impact in terms of the recovery of this algae. Generally, recovery is extremely slow, and sometimes it takes up to 4 years before a harvested area has recovered enough to be able to be harvested again. Based on these examples, can you identify the types of harvesting that are being done in these examples? This is showing what I think most of you are facing in your respective countries with Sargassum. Can you identify the type of harvesting that's done there? Type 1, type 4? Yes. It is algae that has been carried by currents that are being deposited on the shoreline. On the top, you see direct circulation on the shoreline, on beaches. And the picture in the bottom, although the Sargassum isn't on the beach itself yet, in any event, if the Sargassum isn't collected there while it's floating in the water, eventually it's going to make it onto the beach. And so the Sargassum phenomenon that we're seeing in the Caribbean, when it's at this stage, we can classify as an eventual type 4 harvesting situation. And what can we say about the different harvesting methods and what we must know about the harvesting methods. First of all, the features. Is it in general manual, mechanical, mixed? And specifically, what cutting or removal tools are used? As we saw, a rake, a trident, knives, a sickle, any pumping structures or collection structures carried by boats. We also need to know what part of the plant is being removed, what extent, how much of the plant is being removed. Are we uprooting the plant? Are we only cutting the part of the plant that's above the root? Are we cutting out reproductive structures? Are we cutting out the top of the plant without compromising reproductive structures? When does this harvesting occur? Are the plants being harvested at the beginning of their growth cycle, or once the plants have reached adulthood? Something that's very important to keep in mind in terms of the harvesting methods is the extent of the harvest. Are we talking about long stretches of the coast, 5-10 kilometers? Are we harvesting in very specific areas? Are we going within a particular area where patches are being harvested? Let's say that there's a huge expanse that's covered, and then a boat passes and harvests along a strip, leaving a line behind of cleared seaweed or algae, and then returning in the opposite direction with another strip. Are we leaving spaces of undisturbed biomass in between? And what is the amount of biomass that's being removed at each layer, at each place, in each region? Are we talking about 17%, 30%, 70%? And that is something that we need to take into account in terms of the layers, the places where the harvesting is taking place, and the region as a whole. Also, the frequency of harvesting. Does this take place once a year? You'll see examples where harvesting is undertaken every 3 years or every 4 years, at times even 5 years. There's also examples where harvesting takes place once a year, once a month, once a week, even on a daily basis. In a particular area, especially a large area, the harvesting areas can be alternated so that one day collection is done in one spot, the next day in another spot, and so the harvesting areas are rotated. Also, what time of year is harvesting done so that the resource is not compromised, as we saw with the previous example. Let's look now at the ecological effects of harvesting. And in general, the ecological effects of harvesting algae is similar to what would occur due to natural disturbances, because storms, storm surges remove part or the entirety of an algal population, and it provides space for the species itself to repopulate or for other resources to take over that space. Natural disturbances, of course, vary in severity, in their extent and frequency. And keep in mind that the interaction of these factors with the life cycle and phenotypic attributes of the affected species are what regulate the recovery of the resource and subsequent succession and the structure of the community. The magnitude of the ecological impact of harvesting algae is therefore related to the size of the harvested area. As we mentioned before, it's related to the frequency of harvesting, as well as the technique that is applied. And obviously, it's very much tied to the vulnerability of the species in terms of when the reproductive period takes place, what's the recruitment rate, what the recruitment rate is like, what the growth rate and what the rate of the generation is like. All of these factors will determine the ecological impact that harvesting has on different species of algae. The effects of harvesting can therefore vary enormously from minimal effects to highly significant effects, depending on how harvesting is undertaken. And this applies both to the harvested populations themselves and their associated species, depending on the type of harvesting that is being carried out. Here, we're going to mention some of the ecological effects of overexploitation. In harvested populations themselves, also in terms of communities, the communities that these alga species belong to, and in terms of the ecosystem. So these are the three levels where we see ecological effects. Within harvested populations, usually there are changes in recruitment, in survival rates, abundance, and stability. If there is overexploitation of a particular population, usually recruitment is diminished, survival is also affected, as well as abundance, and that means that there can be significant problems with the stability of that population. And these population-wide changes in terms of the sizes of those populations, those can affect the communities that these species belong to. And if the disruption is large enough to affect communities, then that can also affect the ecosystem. Just to recap, harvests can therefore be as frequent, as intense, and as extensive as the biological attributes of the exploited population will allow, in terms of a recovery that will maintain sustainable biomass over time. I'm going to give you two very interesting examples. One is the macrocystis harvesting that is done in the western coast of the Baja California Peninsula. It used to be harvested as well in California, in the USA. Here you see the boat that I mentioned before, And later on, Dr. Roberto Marquez is going to take you through how this suction system works. But the key thing to keep in mind here is that harvesting is only undertaken along the upper portion of the fronds. The reproductive structures of the plant remain unharmed. And Microcystis harvesting in California, in the US that is, were under study for many, many, many years. Always focusing on the effects of this harvesting on the Microcystis population, but also the effect on associated species, whether they were other algae or organisms that live in these algae or that feed on them. There's been a wealth of material produced on this topic. And Dr. North has produced what we refer to as a Microcystis Bible, with just a wealth of documentation on how harvesting this species has affected all the organisms that live in and around the algae and that feed on the algae. And based on that research, the conclusion was that the type of harvesting being done in California, in the US, had very, very small effects. And that it could even be argued that the effects could be even beneficial. And that's because harvesting Microcystis usually, as we mentioned, entails clipping the upper portion of the fronds. And Microcystis has a two-phase life cycle. Here, which is the sporophyte, which is the plant, which is huge. It even grows up to 30 meters in length. It grows about 30 centimeters a day or more, sometimes up to 50 centimeters. But the early stages require the joining involves small, tiny filaments that require photosynthesis, and they're at the very bottom of the sea, and they need sunlight for the female parts and the male parts to produce what's needed for fertilization to take place. And that leads to the sporophyte. And the sporophylls are large and it's darker leaves. And the fronds grow out of a central stem, and those fronds are constantly growing. And the more light that penetrates to the lower layers, the more that reproductive action will be able to take place, and the more the leaves and the fronds are able to undertake the photosynthesis that's needed for them to grow. And therefore, the harvesting of the upper portions of the plant allows more sunlight to penetrate. That's what Dr. North means when he mentions that harvesting with this method, with this species, can be beneficial. And also, the size of this population is so large that the harvesting that was taking place at the time was not really affecting the population size. We've been doing research as well in the central coast of the Baja California Peninsula. I think we began in 1982. The Autonomous University of Baja California has also been undertaking a lot of research in the northern portion of the peninsula. And in sum, the conclusion is that the way in which the Macrocystis harvest was being done up to 2004 was not affecting Macrocystis populations, nor was it affecting the populations of any associated resources. And fortunately, we can say that related resources were not being affected because we had a great experience when we were trying to certify lobster fisheries. Part of the requirements included research on other resources to demonstrate that the lobster fishery was not affecting other resources. And so we were able to look at our research on Macrocystis, the abundance surveys that were undertaken starting in 1982 and then again in 1986. And these were seasonal evaluations, as well as all of the research that had been undertaken on Helidium harvesting. And that, the Gelidium harvesting, and that helped us to substantiate the applications for certifications for the lobster fishery. And it was with all of the research that was done, we were able to show that Macrocystis harvesting was not affecting any associated organisms. And that was a great experience for us. Another example that I wanted to show you. No, I'm having some trouble with the slides here. Yes, so the other example is Gelidium pristoides. Based on research by Anderson et al. Their research came to the conclusion that epiphytic animals, algae, or benthic animals were not being significantly affected by commercial harvesting of Gelidium. In the Baja California Peninsula, we have been doing research for decades. Saldaña, Del Pro have been at it for even longer than we have. The Autonomous University of Baja California as well. Just there's a few institutions that are actively researching the peninsula, and our results suggest that at the current level of exploitation, harvesting Gelidium does not affect natural populations in the peninsula because of the way the harvesting takes place in terms of the frequency of the layers, the frequency with which it is harvesting, the harvesting of specific layers, thus far, natural populations have not been affected, both in terms of the gelidium populations themselves, but also populations of associated organisms. And this brings us to the conclusion of today's introduction to types of harvesting. Thank you very much, Doctor. Can we proceed to the Q&A session? Yes, of course. My colleagues, David Lora, Roberto, and Marcos, will also be taking part in this portion. Question: any examples where harvesting has affected macroalgae? Yes, we're going to look at some examples on Wednesday. But just to give you an idea, pelagic sargassum in the Philippines, there's a particular area, also gracilaria harvesting during the 70s in Chile, also agarophytes in Brazil in 2000. Those are some examples. Perhaps Roberto or Dr. David would like to speak on this subject. Yes, gracilaria in Chile is what I would have mentioned. We lost you there for a moment. There have been a lot of problems with overexploitation with Lisonia and the recovery of Lisonia layers because they do trawling, which uproots the plant because they think that there is going to be more area for spores to colonize. But that's been a problem because it's not actually happening, especially in the north of Chile.
Sí, gracias.
Thank you for that comment.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Any other questions?
Sí, doctora, deme un segundo, por favor.
Yes, one moment, please.
Tenemos una pregunta del salón en inglés. Específica.
A question from the English-speaking room. Specifically, what part of the plant is harvested under type 4? Under type 4 is what's deposited onto beaches and shorelines. So usually you pick up the whole algae. It's whatever ends up washing up ashore, so you tend to collect the whole thing.
Gracias, doctora.
Thank you, doctor. Another question. What experiences have you had in the Caribbean? Because in Barbados, our experience hasn't been with the whole plant, but with the parts of the plant that float freely. We're actually going to look at this in detail on Wednesday. But in terms of classifying the harvest types that we saw today, in my opinion, the type of harvesting that's done with floating sargassum that washes ashore is usually type 4 because it's not a resident population that's growing there, that remains there over time, over years. It's volumes arriving from elsewhere. They grow to some extent while they're being carried by the currents, but at the end of the day, they're going to die. So I would say it's type 4, in my opinion. That would be the harvesting type that's used for that kind of algae.
Otra pregunta, doctora, si me permite un momento.
Sí.
Do we have time for another question? Yes, of course. We just need one moment.
Doctora, otra pregunta del salón en inglés.
Sí.
Another question from the English-speaking room. Beyond the issue of harvesting, are we also going to look at other potential uses for sargassum that currently is a nuisance for us? Any beneficial uses? Yes, that is going to be the last topic that we look at on Friday. We're going to talk at length about potential uses of sargassum.
Gracias, doctora.
Thank you, Dr. Casas Valdez. We're just allowing a bit more time to see if any more questions come in. While we wait, we'd like to remind participants that for tomorrow's session, we will be using the same URL that we used today. We won't be sending any additional links to join the meeting. We'll be using the same one that we used today. In addition, we wanted to let you know that we're going to send you a URL for you to download all of the materials, including the presentations that are being used in the shared screens, as well as reference materials. That URL will be shared via WebEx. Yes, that is a very important thing to note, because sometimes just listening to a lecture like this isn't enough for us to absorb things fully. Reading allows for further digestion of the ideas and the concepts, and please feel free to send emails with any questions, should any arise. I've been talking to Steve Nichols. I'm a bit delayed in terms of responding to the last correspondence, but we've been talking a lot about the use of sargassum in St. Vincent. And there's also another young man who wrote to me, and I sent him materials on manual harvesting of sargassum.
Sí, buenas tardes, David Lora.
Hi, good afternoon. This is David Lora speaking. Good afternoon, Margarita. Just a brief comment regarding type 4 harvesting. With this type of harvesting, we need to keep in mind that since these are algae that's washing up ashore, there could be a variety of species that are being accumulated. And so for commercial purposes, that's something that we need to keep in mind. And I mean, if we're planning to produce something from what's being harvested, that mix of different species, different types of algae is something that we need to keep in mind, because that means that there might be different types of algae together, and that has implications in terms of what you can then do with the algae. With the other types, type 1, type 2, type 3, it's specific harvesting of specific species. But what we see in the Caribbean, what gets to shore is mixed. Usually what's found floating out in the water is usually more specific to a particular species. So that's something to keep in mind.
Muchas gracias, doctora. Por el momento no tenemos más preguntas en ninguno de los.
Thank you very much. It seems that there are no further questions in either the Spanish-speaking or the English-speaking room. We're not seeing anything from the French-speaking room either. We've shared the URL on WebEx itself, and that's a link to the presentations and other reference materials. Please follow the link and download everything. Have a look at the materials. Thank you very much. Therefore, until tomorrow, we're starting at 9. For us, the facilitators, we can log in a bit in advance. Yes, indeed. The facilitators and the organizers can log in 5 to 10 minutes in advance, and then hopefully so we can start at 11 o'clock TT time, 10 o'clock Panama and Mexico City time, and 9 o'clock for La Paz, and 8 a.m. for Senado. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. Our thanks also to the facilitators and the organizers. Thank you, Dr. Casas Valdez. See you tomorrow. Until tomorrow, then, my best to all. Goodbye.